Medieval peasants weren't supposed to travel, it was literally illegal. So when thousands of them somehow crossed entire kingdoms anyway, where exactly did people with no money, no rights, and no connections sleep at night? The answer reveals a hidden world most historians ignore. Most peasants never traveled more than 15 miles from where they were born. Their entire lives, birth, marriage, death, all within walking distance of the same church steeple. So why would anyone leave? Money, plain and simple. Seasonal harvest work paid triple wages in distant regions. A peasant scraping by on 2 pence daily could earn 6 pence cutting wheat 3 counties over. That's the difference between eating and watching your children starve. But here's the thing. You couldn't just leave. Your lord owned you. Not literally owned, but close enough. Peasants needed permission to travel, and lords weren't exactly handing out hall passes. Enter the pilgrimage loophole. The church said visiting holy sites cleansed your soul. Lords couldn't easily refuse a man claiming religious devotion. So peasants suddenly became very, very pious when they needed to travel somewhere. Convenient timing, right? Then there's market day. Surplus eggs, homespun cloth, carved wooden spoons, all worthless unless you could sell them. Walking 20 miles to a market town meant maybe earning enough to survive winter. Maybe. Young men had another reason. Apprenticeships. A 14-year-old might walk over 100 miles to reach a guild town where a blacksmith or carpenter would teach him a trade. His parents would never see him again for 7 years. Sometimes never at all. And then there were the desperate ones. Famine hit, war came, plague swept through, entire families grabbed whatever they could carry and ran. No destination, no plan. Just away. I sometimes think about my own commute and complain about traffic. These people walked for weeks not knowing if they'd find food that night. Here's what nobody tells you about medieval peasant travel. It wasn't romantic wandering through countryside. It was a calculated gamble. Every journey meant risking everything you had against the chance of something better. But once you decided to go, you faced an immediate problem. How do you afford it when a single night's lodging costs half your daily wages? The economics of peasant travel will genuinely surprise you. So peasants needed to travel. Fine. But here's where things get brutal. A day laborer in medieval England earned roughly 2 pence daily. One night at an inn, 1 penny. That's half your wages gone before you've eaten a single bite. Most traveling peasants did the math and made a simple decision. They budgeted for 0 lodging costs. None. They planned to sleep rough from day one. But lodging wasn't even the biggest expense. Not by a long shot. Walking 15 to 20 miles daily burns about 4,000 calories. That's almost double what a normal person needs sitting around. Your body becomes a furnace that constantly demands fuel. Food ate through money faster than any bed ever could. Smart travelers figured out tricks, though. They timed journeys for harvest festivals when villages offered free meals to passing workers. Show up during a celebration, help with some threshing, and suddenly you're eating better than you did at home. Then there's the Pilgrim scam. And yes, I'm calling it a scam because that's exactly what it was. Pilgrims received charity wherever they went. Church rules practically demanded it. So some clever traders started carrying religious tokens and crosses even when their real purpose was selling wool 3 towns over. They'd pray publicly, accept the free bread, then quietly conduct business on the side. Was it dishonest? Absolutely. Did it work? Every single time. Here's something most people miss, though. If you were carrying trade goods to sell, your profit calculations had to be razor sharp. You needed to earn more from the sale than you spent getting there and back. One bad deal, one stolen bag, and you'd return home poorer than when you left. Some traders walked 80 miles only to discover prices had crashed. They'd sold their goods at a loss and still had to somehow afford the journey home. The economics were brutal. The margins were thin. And one wrong decision meant disaster. But knowing the costs is only half the equation. How did people actually cover those miles? Well, that's where things get interesting. Walking. That was it. That was the transportation plan for 90% of peasant journeys. No backup option. No plan B. Here's why. A decent horse cost around 2 pounds. A peasant earned maybe 4 pounds in an entire year. So buying a horse meant giving up 6 months of wages. Then you had to feed the thing. Horses eat about 20 pounds of food daily. That's more than most peasant families consumed. So feed it was. Now, the speed varied wildly, depending on the road. Roman roads still crisscrossed Europe, and on those stone surfaces, a healthy adult could knock out 20 to 25 miles daily. Not bad, but most peasants weren't traveling on Roman roads. They were trudging through muddy tracks that turned into swamps every time it rained. On those paths, 10 to 15 miles was a good day. Maybe less if you were carrying trade goods. And the shoes. Oh, the shoes! Leather footwear wore out in roughly 300 miles. That's about 2 weeks of hard walking. So many peasants did something that sounds crazy, but made perfect sense. They walked barefoot and saved their shoes for entering towns. Showing up barefoot meant getting treated like a beggar. Showing up with shoes meant getting treated like a person. Walking sticks weren't just for old men either. Every serious traveler carried one. You'd use it to test boggy ground before stepping in, to fight off aggressive dogs, to fend off anyone with bad intentions. Basically, a Swiss Army knife made of wood. But here's what really helped. Groups formed naturally on roads. You'd start walking alone, meet another traveler, then another. By afternoon, you might be in a pack of 30 or 40 people. Safety in numbers. Bandits thought twice about attacking large groups. The real journey enders weren't bandits anyway. Blisters got infected. Foot rot set in from wet conditions. Leg injuries turned minor trips into month-long ordeals. More journeys ended from foot problems than from any human threat. But what if you couldn't walk anymore? What if your feet just gave out? Well, there were other options. Slower options, stranger options. Walking worked, but it destroyed your body. So peasants got creative about hitching rides whenever possible. Merchant carts rumbled along every major trade route. And here's the deal most people don't realize. Drivers actually wanted company. A solo merchant hauling wool or grain made an easy target for bandits. But a cart with 3 or 4 rough-looking peasants aboard? Suddenly less appealing. The arrangement was simple. You paid a small fee, maybe a halfpenny, or you helped load and unload goods at each stop. Some merchants just wanted conversation during those boring 12-hour hauls. Fair trade, honestly. But carts had a catch that seems ridiculous until you think about it. Ox carts moved at 2 miles per hour. That's slower than walking. Seriously. A grandmother with a bad hip could outpace most loaded carts. So why bother? Because you could rest, sleep even. Let your blistered feet recover while the oxen did the work. Sometimes slower is smarter. Rivers offered something better. Boat travel moved 4 times faster than walking and burned almost no energy. A peasant could cover 80 miles in a day floating downstream. The problem? Boats ran on schedules. Missed the morning departure and you waited until tomorrow or next week. Ferry crossings charged fees at every river junction. Poor travelers sometimes walked 10 miles upstream just to find a shallow spot they could wade across. Worth it to save a penny. And here's a trick clever peasants discovered. Winter changed everything. When rivers froze solid, they became free highways. No ferryman collecting tolls, no waiting for boats, just miles of flat ice stretching toward your destination. Many peasants deliberately waited for freezing weather before attempting long journeys. Cold, yes, but free. The luckiest travelers found wealthy people heading the same direction. Nobles and rich merchants hired peasants as guards, porters, or just extra bodies to look intimidating. The pay? Free passage, and sometimes meals. Still, most journeys meant walking, and walking meant needing somewhere to sleep each night. That's where monasteries entered the picture, and they offered something almost unbelievable. Now here's where things got interesting for broke travelers. Monasteries weren't just religious buildings, they were basically the medieval equivalent of free hotels. And I mean genuinely free. The Benedictine rule, written back in the 6th century, commanded monks to treat every traveler as if Christ himself had just walked through the door. That's not a suggestion. That's holy law. So when a filthy peasant stumbled up to monastery gates after walking 20 miles, monks couldn't turn him away. Wouldn't be Christian, but let's be honest. The monks weren't exactly rolling out red carpets for everyone equally. Monastery guest houses had a clever system. Nobles got the nice quarters, clean beds, decent food, maybe some wine. Peasants? They got the other building. Still, a roof overhead, fresh bread, weak ale, and a pile of straw to sleep on beat sleeping under a bridge by a mile. The deal was simple. 3 nights maximum, no charge. After that, the brothers would gently but firmly suggest you continue your journey. Overstay your welcome, and suddenly everyone forgot how to speak your language. Here's what made this system work so well for travelers. By the 1200s, England alone had over 1,500 monasteries, and whoever planned this out deserves credit because they ended up spaced roughly a day's walk apart on major routes. Convenient? Almost suspiciously so. The catch nobody mentions? Guests attended prayers. All of them, including the one at 3 in the morning. Miss that and you're suddenly less welcome. Show up drunk or cause trouble? Banned for life. Monks kept records. They actually maintained traveler books with names and destinations, medieval guest registries. Some still exist today, so monasteries offered the best deal going. Free food, free bed, relative safety. The price was waking up before dawn to pray with sleep-deprived monks who'd been doing this since midnight. Most peasants considered that a bargain, but monasteries weren't everywhere, and sometimes you couldn't reach one before nightfall. When that happened, you had to spend money, and that meant dealing with alehouses where things got considerably less holy. So monasteries gave you free beds and holy obligations. But what if you had a few coins jingling in your pocket and wanted something without the 3 a.m. prayers? Welcome to the alehouse. Medieval England's answer to budget motels, except with more fleas and significantly more drunk strangers. Here's what most people get wrong. When we say inn, we picture private rooms with beds, cozy fireplaces, maybe a friendly innkeeper. That existed, sure, for merchants, for minor nobles, for anyone with actual money. Peasants, they got alehouses. 1 penny bought you floor space in a common room. That's it. You and 20 to 30 complete strangers packed shoulder to shoulder like medieval sardines. No bedding provided. You brought your own cloak or found some straw and hoped for the best. The warmth came from other bodies. The smell came from other bodies too. And theft? Constant. Absolutely constant. Experienced travelers developed a whole system. Sleep directly on top of your belongings. Keep your knife where you can grab it fast. Position yourself near walls so nobody could approach from behind. Trust no one. Not even the grandmother-looking woman in the corner. Especially not her. The food situation wasn't much better. Innkeepers legally had to accept all paying customers. That was the law. But nothing stopped them from charging peasants double while serving yesterday's mystery stew. Was that meat? Possibly. Was it meat from this month? Debatable. Now here's where it gets interesting. Some alehouses doubled as brothels. Everyone knew which ones. Respectable travelers, especially those claiming to be pilgrims, avoided these places despite the cheap prices. Getting spotted at a questionable establishment could ruin your reputation in multiple villages. But for exhausted peasants with limited options, sometimes you took the sketchy alehouse because the alternative was sleeping under a bridge in the rain. The real question becomes, what happened when you couldn't afford even a penny? When the alehouses were full and the monasteries were days away? Turns out, medieval farmers had their own unwritten rules about strangers appearing at their doors after dark. Here's the thing about medieval peasants. They weren't shy. If you needed somewhere to sleep and passed a farmhouse, you walked right up to that door, hat off, head slightly bowed, and you asked. Sounds terrifying, right? Knocking on a stranger's door at dusk, hoping they won't set the dogs on you? But it worked, constantly. Farmers regularly let travelers sleep in their barns, sometimes free, sometimes in exchange for a few hours splitting wood or hauling water. Fair trade, honestly. You got a roof, they got free labor. Everyone wins. And those barns, they were actually fantastic. I know. Sleeping with livestock sounds like the setup for a bad joke, but here's what most people miss. A barn full of cows and sheep stays 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside. Those animals are basically giant space heaters with hooves, plus hay piles might be the most comfortable medieval bedding that existed. Soft, warm, and unlike inn mattresses, they weren't crawling with bed bugs that had eaten from 50 strangers before you. Now, the approach mattered everything. You showed up before dark, never after. A stranger appearing at nightfall looked like trouble, but someone arriving with daylight left, offering to help with evening chores, that person seemed useful. The unwritten rule was simple. Be humble. Be helpful. Don't touch anything without asking. Church law actually backed travelers up here. Christians were technically required to offer shelter to those in need, so peasants had moral leverage when asking. Not that everyone followed this rule, but it gave you something to work with. But here's the risk nobody mentions. Some farmers were suspicious types. They'd let you sleep in their barn, then accuse you of stealing a chicken come morning. Suddenly you're getting beaten by farmhands or dragged before a local bailiff. Smart travelers slept near the barn door. Easy escape route. Still, despite the risks, barn sleeping remained one of the best options available. Warm, free, and relatively safe. Though sometimes even barns weren't an option. Sometimes you ended up with nothing but sky above you. So monasteries were full. Inns cost too much. The farmer said no. Now what? You slept outside, and honestly, millions of medieval peasants did exactly this. Not by choice, by necessity. Bridges became the first option. That overhead cover blocked rain and wind. Bridge sleeping was so common that bridge dwellers became an actual social class. Entire communities of homeless travelers lived under major crossings. Some bridges had unofficial rules about which spots belonged to regulars. But here's what nobody tells you. Bridges were obvious. Too obvious. Every thief, every desperate person, every dangerous stranger knew where sleeping travelers gathered. Smart peasants avoided them. The real trick? Invisibility. Hollow trees worked surprisingly well. So did rock overhangs and abandoned buildings. Anything that hid you from the road, because visible sleepers became targets before dawn. Bandits loved the pre-sunrise hours when victims were groggy and disoriented. Now, what about fires? Seems logical, right? Stay warm, cook food, survive the night. Terrible idea. Fires attracted wolves and bandits equally. Experienced travelers slept cold rather than risk being seen. That glow visible from half a mile away was basically a rob me sign. I'd rather shiver than wake up surrounded by strangers with knives. The survival method was simpler. Wool cloaks wrapped tight, leaves piled on top for insulation. This combination could maintain survivable warmth down to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Not comfortable, but you'd wake up alive. Then there's the health cost. Traveler's fever killed more peasants than bandits ever did. Respiratory infections from sleeping cold and wet. One bad night in rain could mean pneumonia within a week. Medieval people understood this connection perfectly. They just couldn't always avoid it. The golden rule: find your spot before darkness fell. Stumbling around at night meant twisted ankles, getting lost, or walking straight into danger. Experienced travelers stopped walking by mid-afternoon to scout good hiding places. Sleeping rough wasn't romantic. It wasn't adventurous. It was desperate survival. But sometimes desperation had an upside, because those same rough conditions created something unexpected. Dedicated hostels specifically for pilgrims, and they changed everything. Here's where things got surprisingly organized. The church realized something clever. If millions of peasants were walking hundreds of miles to holy sites anyway, why not build infrastructure? So they did. And honestly, it worked better than most modern hostel chains. Major pilgrimage routes became the medieval equivalent of interstate highways. Complete with rest stops, the Santiago de Compostela route alone had over 1,000 hostels by the 1100s. That's one roughly every 10 to 15 miles. You could literally walk from France to Spain and never sleep outdoors. Not bad for the Middle Ages, but here's the catch. These weren't open to everyone. Hostels checked credentials. Seriously, you needed proof you were actually on pilgrimage. A scallop shell, a stamped document from your parish priest. Sometimes both. Walk up without the right tokens and suddenly there's no room at the inn. Funny how that worked. And the system got abused constantly. Fake pilgrims flooded the roads. Traders pretending to seek salvation. Criminals escaping justice. Regular travelers who just wanted free beds. By the 1200s, many hostels required proof of recent confession at each stop. Medieval bureaucracy at its finest. The legitimate hostels, though, actually impressive. Some provided hot meals. Others had foot washing stations. A few even offered basic medical care for injured pilgrims. I've stayed at modern hostels with fewer amenities. Then you had the heavy hitters. Military orders like the Knights of St. John didn't just build hostels, they built fortress hostels. Armed protection through the most dangerous territories. Imagine checking into a Holiday Inn where the staff carries swords and has combat training. That's essentially what these were. The whole network created something unexpected. A medieval safety net for the walking poor. As long as you could prove religious intent, doors opened. Food appeared, beds materialized. For peasants who'd never experienced charity without strings, it must have felt miraculous. But pilgrim hostels only covered specific routes. What about everyone else? What about the travelers heading somewhere without a saint's bones at the end? That required different skills entirely. Now here's where street smart separated survivors from sufferers. Carrying 2 pounds of dried beans and oats sounds boring, but that small pouch meant never depending on finding food in an unfriendly village. You could walk for days without begging once. Beans cook in any pot. Oats need only water. My grandfather called this pocket insurance. Smart man. Timing mattered more than most travelers realized. Early autumn? Perfect. Weather still decent. Farmers drowning in harvest surplus. They'd hand out food just to feel generous after a good crop. Try walking in March when everyone's scraping empty barrels. You'll get doors slammed faster than you can say, spare bread. And here's something odd. Latin. Peasants who memorized even 5 Latin phrases unlocked monasteries across every country. Monks from Spain couldn't understand French peasants, but everyone understood Pax Vobiscum and Deo Gratias. Those words were like medieval passwords, but the really clever travelers, they kept mental maps of free food. Certain towns gave parish doles to poor wayfarers every Sunday. Show up Saturday night, sleep near the church, collect bread and ale in the morning, free breakfast. Experienced travelers knew these towns like we know gas station locations on road trips. Merchant caravans offered another hack. Join up with traders heading your direction. You got protection from bandits, better camping spots, sometimes even leftover food. The price? Walk at their pace and help watch for trouble. Fair trade, honestly. Then there's my favorite survival trick, carrying messages between towns. Before postal services, people desperately needed letters delivered. Offer to carry a message from a merchant to his brother in the next city. That grateful merchant might feed you dinner. His brother might give you breakfast. Some travelers made entire journeys this way, eating free at every stop. The difference between a miserable journey and a manageable one came down to knowing these tricks. Peasants who traveled once learned nothing. Peasants who traveled often became experts at working the system. Speaking of systems to work, seasonal patterns affected everything about medieval travel.